The ad hominem argument is widely recognized as being a logical fallacy. But when you have to invent a straw man in order to have something to use your ad hominem against, that's a whole new world of bad arguments. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. Last time, Dr. Craig was telling us the story of how he went from being a newly converted Christian in high school to being a PhD candidate at the University of Birmingham in England. And I just want to take a quick look back at that story because he said something that was just a little bit peculiar. Dr. Craig tells us that as he was nearing the end of his time at Wheaton College, he happened to find a book of apologetics written by one Stuart Hackett. And apparently he found that book to be pretty impressive. Quote, "In contrast to what I had been taught at Wheaton, Hackett, with devastating logic, was defending arguments for God's existence and providing refutations of every conceivable objection to them." End quote. And he follows that up by saying, quote, "The centerpiece of Hackett's case was an argument that struck a deep chord in me. It is rationally inconceivable that the series of past events be infinite. There must have been a beginning of the universe and therefore a transcendent cause that brought it into being. I had to find out if he was right." End quote. So notice, even though Hackett's logic was quote-unquote devastating, and even though he supposedly provided refutations of every conceivable objection, young Bill Craig was not completely convinced that what Hackett said was true. He wanted it to be true, but he honestly couldn't say it was. He had to find out if Hackett was right. And I think that says something about apologetics in general. Believers, and especially Christian apologists, likes to talk about how compelling and undeniable apologetic arguments is supposed to be, because that's what they want to be true. But when it comes right down to it, apologetic arguments is intellectual junk food. You keep coming back for more, but it don't really satisfy on account of there ain't no substance to it. Anyways, that sets us up for what we're going to talk about today in Chapter 4, which is titled, Why Did the Universe Begin? Which, of course, assumes that the universe had a beginning, and like we said before, that ain't the case. There's never been a time when the material universe did not already exist. There's a point in time that's the very earliest moment of time, but that ain't the same as saying that time began at that point. It's like the North Pole. There's a point on the Earth where you's at the North Pole, and that means you can't go no further north. It ain't the beginning of the Earth, it's a location on the Earth, and all other locations is further south. And it's the same with the lower limit of time. It ain't the beginning of time, it's a point in time, and all other points in time is chronologically later. And it don't take no transcendent cause for this to be the case, because it's necessarily true that if in time is finite in the past, then there's going to be one point in time that's earlier than all the others, without requiring any supernatural cause to explain why it's the earliest. So already Dr. Craig is factually incorrect, and we ain't even got past the chapter title yet. So let's see what kind of structure he builds on this faulty foundation. Quote, "Ancient Greek philosophers believed that matter was necessary and uncreated and therefore eternal. God may be responsible for introducing order into the cosmos, but he did not create the universe itself. This Greek view was in contrast to even more ancient Jewish thought about the subject. Hebrew writers held that the universe has not always existed, but was created by God at some point in the past. As the first verse of the Hebrew Holy Scripture states, 'In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.' Genesis 1:1 RSV, end quote. And once again, Dr. Craig is factually incorrect. The idea of creation ex nihilo is a Christian embellishment that was added to the traditional interpretation of Genesis in the 2nd and 3rd century in response to Gnosticism. That's why the phrase ex nihilo itself comes from the Latin, not from Hebrew or Greek. If we look at the actual text itself, we notice that it don't say God created anything out of nothing. And in fact, the translation of Genesis 1:1 in most Christian Bibles is not an accurate translation of the original Hebrew. And I'll put a link in the description where Dr. James Tabor discusses this in some detail. But the gist of it is that Genesis 1:1 is phrased as a temporal construct. Or in other words, it's saying, when God began creating the heavens and the earth was formless and empty with darkness on the surface of the deep, and so on and so on. It ain't a standalone statement declaring that God created heaven and earth. It's a description of what the earth was like at the time God was getting started with his creating. And of course, needless to say, the situation described in Genesis has absolutely nothing in common with Big Bang cosmology. But the main point I want to emphasize here is that Dr. Craig is presenting a revisionist history of what ancient Jews actually believed and taught about the origin of the earth. The original Jewish creation myth was a story about pre-existent matter being reformed and reshaped into the world we have today. Creation ex nihilo was an embellishment added by Christian theologians thousands of years later. And in fact, Dr. Craig even alludes to this in his next paragraph. Quote, there arose within Western philosophy an ongoing debate that lasted for well over 1,000 years about whether or not the universe had a beginning. End quote. But that's a misleading summary. Dr. Craig's trying to make it sound like God had revealed something like Big Bang cosmology to the authors of Genesis, and then Christians came along and was arguing against Greek philosophers. That ain't what happened. The argument was between Christians who followed the original Jewish creation account and Christians who was advocating this new idea of creation ex nihilo. Anyways, Dr. Craig ends his summary with a rather remarkable statement. Quote, the debate finally sputtered to something of an inconclusive finale in the thought of the great 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He held, ironically, that there are rationally compelling reasons for both sides, thereby exposing the bankruptcy of reason itself. End quote. And that's quite a thing for a PhD philosopher to say. But as a commenter pointed out on an earlier video, reason itself is not a source of information. It's a way to reach reliable conclusions about some specific evidence. We still need to rely on real-world observations in order to give reason some hard data to work with. What Dr. Craig doesn't mention is that creation ex nihilo was officially declared to be canonical church dogma at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. So as far as the church was concerned, the debate was over a long time before Immanuel Kant. At this point, Dr. Craig takes another somewhat remarkable turn. Abandoning the Christian philosophers and theologians of the West, he turns to a 12th century Muslim philosopher, Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali. And before I get into that, I want to just take a minute and talk about the difference between an actual scientific explanation and a creation myth. A scientific explanation is a detailed description of a predictable, verifiable process that transforms some set of preconditions into whatever it is we're trying to explain in a way that gives us insights into the inner workings of objective reality. A creation myth, by contrast, is a simple story that you could tell a little kid at bedtime that attributes something in the real world to some magical, invisible, unfalsifiable character without offering any insights into how things really work. And the thing about a creation myth, besides the fact that it don't really explain nothing, is that the magical main character is arbitrary. The connection between the magical character and the thing you've given them credit for boils down to basically because I said so. And that means you can swap out the main character for any other magical being you may prefer. That's why Dr. Craig, a Christian, can step in and borrow a creation myth from a 12th century Muslim and just swap out Allah for a Trinitarian deity. Creation myths lets you swap in whatever creator you want, because it ain't tied to reality the way a scientific explanation is. Anyways, back to Dr. Craig. After making all that fuss about philosophers arguing over whether the universe had a beginning, Dr. Craig is surprisingly brief when it comes to his discussion of Al-Ghazali's opinion on the subject. Quote, he argues that the idea of a beginningless universe is absurd. The universe must have a beginning. End quote. And that's it. You'd think he'd say something about why Al-Ghazali claimed it was absurd, but he don't. I believe he comes back to this point later on, but for right now, he's in too big of a hurry to get to Al-Ghazali's argument for why the universe needs a cause. And Dr. Craig, as usual, puts it in the form of a syllogism. Quote, 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. End quote. And that right there is the foundation of Dr. Craig's famous kalam cosmological argument. And we're going to get into that in great detail, but first, just a quick overview, because there's some things that jump out at me right away whenever I look at it. And maybe the most obvious one is that it ain't an argument for the existence of any God. Every cause we've been able to scientifically verify has turned out to be not God. So saying that the universe has a cause is a long ways away from saying that any God exists. But also, notice that phrase, begins to exist. What does that mean? And especially, what does it mean in the context of a universe that has existed for all of time? If something has never not existed, what does it mean to say it ever began to exist? So right away, we have some issues. But let's see how Dr. Craig tries to turn this into some kind of argument for God in general and for his God in particular. Quote, if the two premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. So anybody who wants to deny the conclusion must regard either premise 1 or premise 2 as false. So the whole question is it more probable that these statements are true or that they are false? End quote. And as we've seen, this is a false dichotomy due to oversimplification. Being false ain't the only way that a premise can lead to faulty conclusions. It can also screw up by including ambiguous terms, or omitting significant relevant information, or including information that's irrelevant and misleading. It can also use loaded language to smuggle in unacknowledged and unsupported assumptions, or to trigger emotional responses that make the listener more likely to jump to irrational conclusions. So there's a lot more to it than just whether a premise is in some sense more probably true than false. Well, fortunately for Dr. Craig, most folks in his target audience ain't going to get that sophisticated in their analysis of his argument. They bought his book looking for simplistic arguments they can use to make themselves feel better about believing what other Christians has told them. And Dr. Craig aims to give them just that, starting with premise 1. Quote, I think that the first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, is virtually undeniable for any sincere seeker after truth. For something to come into being without any cause whatsoever would be to come into being from nothing. That is surely impossible. End quote. And this is false. The alternative to caused existence is spontaneous existence, and that ain't the same thing as existence out of nothing. For example, An atom of uranium-238 will spontaneously decay into an alpha particle and a thorium-234 atom. No external factor is causing it to decay, it's just something that happens. And when it does happen, an alpha particle and a thorium atom begin to exist without any cause. Now that's different from beginning to exist out of nothing. They both come from a pre-existing uranium atom, but there ain't no actual cause for why at some particular point in time the uranium atom ceased to exist and the alpha particle and thorium atom began to exist. Also, this is an example of a premise being unreliable because it omits significant, relevant information. As we look at the real world, we see that things have scientific explanations. That is to say, they have certain preconditions that's necessary before they can come into existence, and certain pre-existing materials out of which they can be formed, and a cause, or in other words, a predictable, verifiable process by which the pre-existing materials is transformed into the thing that we say begins to exist. Now, all of that is relevant and necessary for a meaningful discussion of how things come into existence. And yet Dr. Craig omits everything but the abstract notions of cause and existence. And the reason is obvious. He wants to argue that they can be causes that brings things into existence in the absence of any pre-existing materials and any predictable, verifiable process. But that's an assumption he can't justify either philosophically or scientifically, so he's using selective omission to smuggle it in. So even if we assume premise 1 is arguably true in some sense, it's still incomplete. And that lack of information gives Dr. Craig an opening into which he can insert imaginary causes without having to explicitly justify them. Meanwhile, he continues with 3 arguments that he makes in support of the claim that premise 1 is true. Quote, 1. Something cannot come into existence from nothing. To claim that something can come into being from nothing is worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, at least you've got the magician. But if you deny premise 1, you've got to think that the whole universe just appeared at some point in the past for no reason whatsoever. End quote. And of course, his unspoken and unjustified assumption here is that there was some prior point in time when nothing existed. And that's obviously false because time itself exists at every point in time, and that ain't nothing, it's something. So the question of whether or not something can come from nothing is an entirely moot point. There never was nothing, so there was never any point when something could have come out of it, with or without any cause. But wait, there's more. He got an ironclad argument for why something can't come from nothing. Quote, in The Sound of Music, when Captain Von Trapp and Maria reveal their love for each other, what does Maria say? Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. End quote. And of course, Rogers and Hammerstein won a Nobel Prize in Physics for including that little lyric in their musical, right? Sarcasm aside, it's interesting to notice what Dr. Craig is doing here. He's including a reference to a highly emotional scene from a very popular musical with a beautiful score and soft focus and a secluded moonlit garden and all, in order to add an element of emotional appeal to premise 1. And emotional appeals is one of the ways a premise can be unreliable and can lead to unreliable conclusions. Dr. Craig next dips his toes into particle physics, where he plays a bit of a shell game. Quote, sometimes skeptics will respond to this point by saying that in physics, subatomic particles, so-called virtual particles, come into being from nothing. This skeptical response represents a deliberate misuse of science. The theories in question have to do with particles originating as a fluctuation of the energy contained in the vacuum. End quote. We'll just skip over the irony of an apologist accusing skeptics of deliberately misusing science. What Dr. Craig is pointing out here is that, yes, technically a vacuum is not nothing in the philosophical sense of the word nothing. And lots of skeptics has had the same criticism regarding how Lawrence Krauss and others has described virtual particles as being something from nothing. Where the shell game comes in is when Dr. Craig switches from talking about causes to talking about something from nothing. Premise 1 states that everything that begins to exist has a cause, but virtual particles pop into and out of existence spontaneously, or in other words, without any cause, assuming they exist at all, which I understand has not yet been conclusively demonstrated. But if and they do exist, then there's technically a counterexample that disproves premise 1. But Dr. Craig don't discuss virtual particles when he's talking about premise 1 directly. He only brings it up under a sub-argument where he's discussing something from nothing so he can claim that skeptics is wrong about something. And in fact, they ain't even wrong. They're just talking about science and the scientific sense of the word nothing as opposed to the philosophical sense. So this whole argument boils down to taking the quotation out of context just so he can falsely accuse skeptics of misusing science. And he keeps the ad hominem ball rolling in this next part. Quote, when I first published my work on the kalam cosmological argument back in 1979, I figured that atheists would attack premise 2 of the argument that the universe began to exist. But I didn't think they'd go after premise 1, for that would expose them as people not sincerely seeking after truth, but just looking for an academic refutation of the argument. End quote. And look at all the spin he's putting on that one. He don't say that attacking premise 1 might imply that skeptics weren't sincerely interested in the truth, as if there was some doubt about whether they was or not. He says it would expose them as not sincerely seeking the truth. It ain't that they might be insincere, they definitely insincere. But attacking premise 1 would expose their insincerity. And that's some serious ad hominem fallacy right there. Never mind that premise 1 is demonstrably false and has other flaws besides. Skeptics is supposedly insincere, so we can just ignore all their arguments instead of responding to them. Textbook ad hominem. And he continues, quote, what a surprise, then, to hear atheists denying premise 1 in order to escape the argument. For example, Quentin Smith of Western Michigan University responded that the most rational position to hold is that the universe came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. A nice close to a Gettysburg Address of atheism, perhaps. End quote. So it ain't that skeptics has any valid reasons for criticizing premise 1. It's that they's trying to, quote-unquote, escape the argument. And here's a nice quote out of context that ain't even a whole sentence to prove it. I kind of suspect that if Dr. Craig put as much effort into responding to skeptical criticisms of the first premise as he puts into dodging the criticisms and pointing accusatory fingers at skeptics, well, even then I reckon he'd still come up short. So, from a strategic standpoint, I guess I can understand why he'd rather turn to ad hominem fallacies here. And, of course, he has to deploy that time-honored apologetic tactic of trying to discredit skeptics by accusing them of being like Christians. Quote, this is simply the faith of an atheist. In fact, I think this represents a greater leap of faith than belief in the existence of God. For it is, I repeat, literally worse than magic. If this is the alternative to belief in God, then unbelievers can never accuse believers of irrationality, for what could be more evidently irrational than this? End quote. So in other words, apparently he's saying it's irrational to base your beliefs on faith, and the more faith you have, the more irrational you are. Okay, Dr. Craig, thanks for clearing that up for us. We'll keep that in mind next time somebody tells us we need to have faith in Jesus. But I particularly like that last sentence where he says that if one person believes something that's really irrational, he can't never identify anyone else's logical fallacies. I mean, I can understand the emotional appeal here, what with pots and kettles calling each other black and all, but this right here could very well be the biggest ad hominem fallacy of all. He's basically accusing atheists of being so irrational that believers ought to just ignore skeptics anytime they points out the logical fallacies and factual inaccuracies that apologists relies on to dazzle the flock. And skeptics ain't even being irrational. Whenever there's no evidence for a cause, the rational thing to do is to say that as far as we know, they ain't no cause, even apart from the fact that Dr. Craig's whole criticism is based on the false assumption that there was some point in time when nothing existed. And remember, he even admitted that physicists don't mean philosophical nothing when they's talking about the universe coming to existence out of nothing. That was his whole rebuttal to the stuff about virtual particles. So he knows that Big Bang cosmology ain't proposing that the universe popped into being out of literal nothing. And yet, that don't stop him from pretending that this is what scientists is claiming, so's he can accuse them of believing in magic, so's he can trick the flock into ignoring the evidence of science and the criticisms of skeptics. He's inventing a straw man so's he can use an ad hominem argument against it and thus avoid addressing the facts. And I think this is a good stopping point right here. I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time we'll pick up with argument number 2 for why premise 1 is supposedly true. And let me tell you, it's a doozy, but no spoilers. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.